Oh, this is one of my 25 litre repurposed containers. Previously held a car wash. It's all been washed out, and I'm thinking of making this into some sort of wicking bed, or a way of managing the kind of leachate from a wormery. So previously I was using, I think they're 330 milliliter tin cans, so either beer cans or Coke cans or whatever, and I was using those kind of maybe 9 or 10 of those in a base with holes punched near the top so the air can escape and the water can kind of enter, and then that would make like a support for a subfloor. In this case I'm just using some reclaimed acrylic, but rather than using the cans, which can obviously be recycled, I'm still going to use one of the cans where there's going to be an overflow. So there's going to be a hole in here and there's going to be an elbow in there, and the can will be in a way be like a filter, so it sort of stops that overflow from blocking up. So if you imagine, there'll be like a little trap in here, so that the elbow will come up and then it have the can over the top, so the water will be able to pass through and air will be able to pass through, but it won't actually plug up that overflow. So what I'm thinking of doing here, and this was after having a conversation with Dan on the WC UK Facebook group, is to use a material which will break down slowly. So this is just offcuts of studwork timber. So I've cut these slightly higher than the actual can itself. So they'll be like basically upstands, and then they'll support the subfloor. But obviously, being timber, they will soak up moisture as well, and they will wick the moisture up into the bed. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to have the can there as a sort of filter, just a sort of debris blocking up, and then I don't know how many I'm going to use really. I'm going to use part of these offcuts of stud timber, and then I'm going to use biochar as well. So I'm in two minds whether to actually have some sort of wicking fabric coming up in the centre. I've made a 50mm hole, so there could be like a wicking tube coming up, which you could use just an old just something lycra or some sort of bag or something, just to sort of wedge in. So I might have that as a can with the top and bottom cut off, and then a big wadge of wicking fabric, and then a layer of cotton underneath here as well, so that will be permeable, and then this part here will actually wick the moisture through. And with the overflow will be set lower than the level of the block, so that will support the substrate. And obviously I'm just trying to pre-soak these bits of wood at the moment, so the water will never come up to that level, it will always overflow. And then I'm possibly thinking of having an aeration fitting on the side as well, so, and possibly another layer of charcoal as well. And the charcoal acts as a kind of filter, so when the leachate comes through, any nitrates in there, rather than going down into the liquid at the bottom, in theory they'll kind of clamp onto the sort of negative charge on the charcoal, and it will be kind of like an active filter. But what I'm also thinking is, as that moisture wicks up through here as well, it's also going to be wicking through that charcoal. So if you kind of imagine, there's going to be a sort of ebb and flow going through the charcoal. So I'm kind of hoping that's going to keep it from going sort of stagnant and algae growing in the base itself. And obviously, if this was a subfloor for a wormery, you're not going to have an excess of moisture, but there's always going to be sufficient moisture to kind of keep the castings from drying out. And obviously, if that was connected up to an overflow, then the overflow would drain away. And if this was part buried in the soil, then that would be absorbed into the soil, or you could just have a layer of wood chip around there. But this is 3mm acrylic from the laser cutters, so I'm just really trying to find different uses for that. Having this as a sort of separate subfloor might be a little bit over the top really, but I'm just thinking that's going to make a nice level platform in there for the sort of wicking bed itself. And the wicking bed's not going to be any higher than 300mm. On this one, because it's floating at the moment, it's going to be quite a lot lower. But alternatively, I may cut a second container, one of these 25-litre containers, and have the whole wicking set up as a separate sort of part. And for my grow buckets, I'm kind of thinking it would be nice to have those plumbed into a rainwater butt with a kind of float valve, so that will keep them topped up. And then ideally I'd want to have a drain as well, so you can just purge the system through, and then you can overflow that into a kind of container of wood chip, just to, in case there's any kind of too much in terms of sort of nitrate sort of build up in the water. And obviously at the end of the growing season it'd be nice to be able to flush it through as well. But that's the theory anyway. But I think it's quite good. I've tried these just underneath wormeries as a separate container with the wormery sitting on top, and there's loads of worms actually living in the water underneath, and I'm not quite sure why it was so clear, because that was months old, but I just sort of set it up and I kind of forgotten about it, and I just looked at it the other day in the water underneath. It wasn't anaerobic, it didn't smell, and there's some part broken down cardboard, and loads of worms actually in the water, and the water itself was clear as well. It's quite strange. So I'm not sure if it's just because that charcoal is kind of working like a filter, and if you imagine as it heats up, that water vapour is going to kind of be absorbed into those worm castings, and then it's going to, I don't know, as that material breaks down, the excess moisture is going to go back through. So there is a sort of cycle of water movement underneath in that container. And even if you sort of think with condensation, temperature change, the water will kind of, it's not static, there is some sort of movement. But that's the plan so far. And I think what I might do is I'm going to cut some more of these blocks, leave them for a week or so, and then just sort of weigh them just to see how much water they've actually absorbed. And I can kind of work out the volume, and I can work out how much sort of is taken up by the wood itself. But if you imagine, if this was a grow bucket and it's only quite small, that's a big depth of moisture, so that's like a whole season's worth of watering in a way. I mean, it's 4 inches or 5 inches or whatever, it's quite a lot of rainfall. So I don't think it needs that depth, but I'm thinking if I use up a certain volume of that with the timber, there'll be more wicking from the base of that, so there'll be more of a sort of water cycling through. And if I've got this connected up to a water bay, it will be topped up. Maybe, well, ideally what I'd like to do is I'd like the water to completely change within a month or so, and so it's sort of replenished. So depending on how much water capacity is in here, I can have it on a timer, so you'd have, I don't know, 3 hours every week for it to top up, and then it would cut off, and then it would use that water up again. But what is quite nice about this is obviously the timber is a consumable part that will break down, but you're using this excess nitrate to actually provide the kind of nitrogen to break down this high carbon material. I could turn this into biochar, but it's a less sort of labour intensive way of actually making these back into soil again. So you're using them for the fact that they're solid and they're going to support that weight of substrate above them, provide that so those sort of standoffs. But then you're also using the fact that they're slow composting, which is a sort of benefit. You don't want to be replacing these every year. I think maybe 3 or 4 years they'd be really broken down, and there wouldn't be too much support provided. And with this plastic, it's only 3 mil thick, but there's not a huge amount of weight on there. But imagine if that didn't have those, it would tend to sort of bend and dish down. And what I really wanted to do is maintain that air gap underneath. So you've got wicking, and then you've got aeration as well. So that's really good for the worms. It's also really good for the plants. You don't want them to be sitting in standing water, and that's one of the problems with making a kind of wicking bed. But I like this because it's all completely reclaimed materials. The aeration fitting is going to be a bottle cap from a 500 milliliter fizzy water bottle, and the only thing is a small elbow, but they're PVC solvent weld elbows. You can normally find those in skips as well. Just a little bit of overflow pipe, but the overflow pipe's about £3 or I don't know, £2 for 3 meters, so it's very, very cheap. And the grommets, I'm just using electrical grommets. They're 25 millimeters, and the hole in the center is perfect for pushing a 21.5 millimeter outside diameter solvent weld PVC pipe. If you wet the grommet itself, wet the pipe, make sure you deburr the ends of it so it's got a chamfer on it. It takes a bit of wiggling to get it in, but once it's in, that's absolutely watertight. And with this being a wicking bed as well, it's only an overflow, and if you've got that overflow, well, it will be up to the water level, but I'm sort of saying if you had it lower down, then if it leaked a little tiny drip, then you'd lose a bit of water. But If I'm setting these up as wormeries, I'd just have it as an overflow. But if these were actually wicking beds, I'd want the it would be more of a fill kind of inlet as opposed to an overflow. So what would happen is ideally that would be below the water level, and then at the end of the run you'd have the pipe coming round, and then it would bend up, and then you could just sort of twist that round, and then that would drain it out, and then you could stand it up. And what you can do is you can put a cork in there and a piece of wood, and it just gives you an indication what that water level is, so you can kind of bob it up and down to make sure it's not kind of wedged in. But with the wormeries, this is just to manage any leachate at the bottom, and as well as managing leachate, providing that those kind of right sort of conditions sort of for the worms, including moisture level, then that would just be an overflow. But what I quite like of this system as well, it's sort of evolving a little bit as well. And with these containers, because there's a radius on the base, if you cut this container down just to make a kind of a wicking reservoir, you can just stand the other container straight on top, and if you've got a layer of charcoal in there and that's in contact with that cotton, the charcoal is actually going to wick the moisture through as well, so that charcoal is going to stay damp, and then the soil above is going to wick the moisture through, and then it's going to use up the water in the reservoir. So that's my plan anyhow. Thanks.